Good afternoon. My name is Barnaby. I'm an investment analyst at SCM Direct. I'm here with Alan Miller, our Chief Investment Officer, to discuss the greenwashing report we produced earlier this month. So, what is an ethical fund and how quickly is the area growing?
The most common types of ethical fund are ESG funds. ESG stands for Environmental, Social and Governance Funds. So they have three criteria. Environmental criteria considers how a company performs as a steward of nature. Social criteria examines how it manages relationships with employers, suppliers, customers, and the communities where it operates. And then governance deals with a company's leadership, executive pay, internal control, shareholders' rights. SRI, which is a lot of funds you'll see will say ESG fund or SRI fund. The SRI stands for socially responsible investing, and it's normally considered socially responsible due to the nature of the business that the company conducts. For example, social responsible investments normally avoid companies that produce or sell addictive substances like alcohol or gambling or tobacco, and try and encourage companies engaged in social justice, environmental sustainability, alternative clean technology, etc. And then secondly, there's an area within ethical investing called impact investing. Again, there's a lot more people seeking impact investing on ESG and SRI. Now, impact investing is investments made with the intention to generate positive, measurable social and environmental impact alongside a financial return. All these areas are growing very strongly. In fact, according to the UK Investment Association, which looks at most of the assets managed by the UK investment industry, they estimate that 26% of total assets under management within the UK are currently being managed with a responsible investment approach. And as you can see by this chart on the right, the area is forecast to grow strongly, with the whole universe of dedicated sustainable investment funds in Europe and the US is forecast to grow from just under $500 billion in 2013 to 760 billion currently, and much more in the years to come.
So you mentioned these different categories: ESG, SRI, impact investing. How are the FCA defining it, and what about the data providers?
Well, the problem generally is there is no precise and clear definition, and each data provider, of which there are literally more than 100 data providers, with new data providers springing up by the day, all having different definitions and different ways they'll screen companies and score companies. So whilst you might think an individual company like Tesla would have a similar score, whether it's being rated by one provider like Sustainalytics, or another one like the FTSE, or another one like MSCI, so some of the largest data providers in the world, you can see on our chart there, you can have completely different scores. And for example, on the Tesla one in the top left, you might wonder why it's ranked by MSCI at the top, by FTSE at the bottom, and then Sustainalytics in the middle. It turns out that MSCI gave it a near perfect score for the environment due to its emphasis on the low carbon produced and its clean technology, whilst FTSE gave it a 0 on environment as it only rates emissions from its factories. FTSE also assumes, and this is interesting, a company not disclosing a piece of information receives a low score for the missing item. But on the other hand, if a company doesn't provide that same piece of information to MSCI, MSCI takes a completely different attitude and assumes an average score for that piece of missing information. So if you think about it, if you were a company and you wanted to get a good score with MSCI, you might want to simply not answer the questions where you get a low score, and overall you would end up with a higher score. So it shows on these various different charts how you might think, taking that bottom table, the correlation between a company scoring high or low between the different data providers would be very similar. And you can see sometimes the correlation between a good and a bad score or a good score across different providers can be less than 50%. And then if you look at the table above on the right, you can see an almost kind of random correlation between, on the one hand, the scores provided by MSCI and various companies on the bottom, and on the side, the y-axis, the scores by FTSE.
Is anything from the FCA regulator, are they looking into this at all, or how they?
Well, the FCA has produced a number of papers on greenwashing, as have various accountancy bodies, and they all agree there are major issues with the quality of the data, the quality of ratings, the quality of the dangers surrounding greenwashing, but unfortunately there is no common standard. So this area, which is an area which has really grown very quickly in the last few years, what we're saying as a company is we are trying to encourage commonality of standards, commonality of ratings, and trying to improve for clients what we believe that they should know what they're getting, and they should have complete transparency.
So in the report, SCM Direct raised many concerns on the use of government bonds within portfolios. I mean, what's the problem with that?
Well, the problem seems to be a lot of these companies seem to have basically one rule for equities and shares and corporate bonds, where they tend to have investments with certain sectors screened out and certain criteria screened out, and then within the same portfolio, which is meant to be the ethical portfolio, we can see large amounts in government bonds, where if you apply those same principles which they're applying to the corporate bonds and the shares, you couldn't, in our view, justify the holding of the various government bonds, be they UK government bonds or US government bonds. For example, if you think about the various ethical funds that screen out tobacco stocks, the UK government receives just under £9 billion per annum from the tobacco industry. If you think about the various ethical funds that screen out gaming stocks, well, the UK government receives just under £3 billion per annum from the betting and gaming industry in tax receipts. If you think about the various funds which say we're not going to invest in nuclear weapons, arms manufacturers or arms manufacturers generally, well, of course, the UK government has got exposure to nuclear weapons by its Trident nuclear program of submarines. And lastly, quite a few ethical funds will say we're not going to be investing in the nuclear industry generally, or the nuclear power industry. And once again, the UK government, whilst it doesn't physically own the nuclear plants, has had for a long time a long-established program of encouraging nuclear power within the UK. And then if you apply the same to the US, of course we have Donald Trump, who's famous for removing the US from the 2015 Paris Agreement, aiming to reduce the emissions of gases that contribute to global warming. So if ever one might say there's a government which wouldn't score highly on the E within the ESG, you might think it's the US government. So it seems shocking to us that these portfolios can have quite often 40, 50, and even up to 95% in just plain vanilla government bond funds.
Okay, so looking a little closer, the report highlighted a number of different funds and investment strategies. These ones kind of came up. Why was that?
Well, the advantage of, I suppose, exchange-traded funds, and the fact that in a lot of mutual funds, then we can, using data tools, actually look for a lot of the holdings. It's always interesting to see, if you like, what the label on the tin says and what it says its policy is, and actually whether it's applying it in practice. And it's interesting, here we have on the left Legal & General ESG fund, and you would have thought an ESG fund, given that most funds within that area tend to have a rule, they avoid tobacco stocks, they avoid alcohol and beverage stocks, they avoid arms companies. And here's a fund It's not breaching its rules or regulations, but it's surprising, if you like, an ESG fund has so much exposure to these areas, particularly tobacco, which tends to be a kind of a no-go area for a lot of ethical funds. And what that fund is doing is applying its own rules and filters and basically tilting its portfolio. But in our view, if somebody invests in an ethical fund, you wouldn't expect to have, say, 4% of your fund into tobacco stocks. And then on the right, we have the Vanguard fund. Again, it's following its own procedures, its own rules and regulations and how it invests. But once again, you might not expect to be holding online gaming companies, various beverage companies, breweries, and lots of kind of major arms manufacturers.
So I suppose the main question is, well, how was the report received, and were any feathers ruffled?
Yes, I think it's safe to say a lot of feathers were ruffled. In particular, and all credit to them, is Fidelity, where the report came out, and when the Sunday Times contacted them, because on their consumer portal, when you search for these ethical funds, a lot of funds would appear which weren't actually ethical funds. Fidelity acted very quickly, changed its filter, and the provider of that data, Morningstar, appears to have changed a lot of its own consumer portals using the same filter of socially responsible funds, where a lot of the funds were really not socially responsible funds at all. A lot of the other companies which we named, interesting, gave, one might say, unusual justifications to the Sunday Times, and we have on this slide some of the kind of more surprising ones. For example, Wealthify, which is part of Aviva, they tried to justify the fact they held a large amount in government bonds, saying all the good stuff which governments do, the governments contribute to healthcare, education, infrastructure and public services. Well, that may be obviously the case, but when people are investing in ethical funds, I would have thought they're trying to avoid the bad part of whether it's companies or governments. So just saying that somebody does one good thing doesn't really actually justify it in our view. And then we had somebody from Nutmeg he didn't really justify why they had this ethical portfolio where just 3% was invested in an SRI fund, but he said that was not representative of its range of ethical portfolios. Well, you might say, if it's not representative, why are you selling it to your clients? But this is a general issue. I'm not picking on these two companies. It's a general issue that there is a limited range of ethical funds, and if whatever your portfolio you want to offer can't find ethical funds to fulfill it, then maybe they shouldn't be offering that portfolio to its clients in the first place.
So what should then investors be looking for? What should they do?
Well, the most important thing, like anything, is to know what you're buying. And because everybody will have different views on individual companies and whether they're ethical or not, we think the first most important starting point is to give everybody 100% transparency. So within the ethical portfolio for us, you can see 100% every single underlying holding. So if you, let's say for example, there's a particular company which you want to avoid and you don't want to be invested in, well, you can look at our list of holdings and you can say, actually, I don't want to invest in an ethical portfolio because it holds company ABC. Secondly, we don't invest in government bond funds. We only invest in funds which are ESG funds or SRI funds. We don't invest in government bonds and somehow pretend somehow they're ethical funds where clearly they're completely different. So we apply rigid filters, we apply rigid rules, but we look under the bonnet, we look at the funds, we always test what they hold, we test how they're complying with these filters and rules, and we try and put together a portfolio of ethical investments that live up to what people expect. And of course, this whole area of ethical investing is is going to get better over years because there'll be more funds available with more different filters and different rules and different techniques. And I imagine in a year or two's time, it'll be more common for a lot of ethical funds, for example, maybe not to hold airline stocks. At the moment, that doesn't exist. Same goes for resource companies like Rio, etc. They're commonly featured in ethical portfolios, but over time, then standards are likely to change and improve. Transparency across the whole industry should improve, and ethical portfolios generally will get better. But we want to be leaders in this area, and that's why we've started our portfolio the way we mean to go on with 100% transparency.
Fantastic, thank you very much.